come back for the second. India have won the Test match.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the 81 All Out podcast. I'm your host, Siddhartha Vaidyanathan. I go by Sid V on Twitter. And I'm delighted to welcome a very special guest on the show today. He's a terrific sports writer and someone who I consider the king of ball-by-ball and over-by-over commentary, Rob Smyth. Welcome, Rob. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Rob has been writing on sport for close to 2 decades now, I think, at least as far as I've been reading. And I love how he combines a keen sense of history with a love for numbers and anecdotes. And reading a Rob piece is, like sitting through a history lesson in football and cricket and whatever else he writes on. And he is one of my favorite writers, and so I thought I should bring him on the show. So thanks again, Rob. And to begin with, let's talk about how it all began. What drew you into sports writing, and how did your journey begin?
So it was something I always wanted to do without having any idea about how to actually do it. And so when I left university, I just kind of had no idea what to do. I was working in the civil service, and I always bought Wisden Cricket Monthly back then, and I think it was December '98. I was going home on a Saturday from doing overtime, and I bought the latest edition. And Alex Tudor was on the cover, having bowled really well at Perth on his Test debut. And basically, in the editor's notes, Tim Delisle drew an analogy between Tudor being like a kind of work experience person, and he said, "If you'd be interested in doing work experience here, please write in." So I did that, and kind of went from there really. About a year later, January 2000, I think I did 2 weeks at WCM, which was terrifying, but also, incredibly exciting. And then a few months later, Channel 4 in England had just had the rights for cricket for a year, and they were starting a new cricket website, and they were looking for someone probably cheap and inexperienced to do just bulletins of the games. And Lawrence Booth, bless him, recommended me as someone to go on their shortlist. And anyway, and I owe Lawrence most of my jobs because he's recommended me so many places. I should give him a percentage really. But anyway, so I did that for the summer, and then I got a full-time job there. And about a year later, I went to work at Wisden.com, which was just to actually work there full-time was surreal and it was an incredible experience. And it just went from there really. Once I was working there, I suppose I felt comfortable enough that I could make a career of it. 18 years later, I'm still doing it. So yeah, that's it.
One of the things I ask many of the writers who come on are their early the things they liked reading early on, books and articles and writers. Was there anyone that you particularly remember who you read and felt that, this is something interesting, I'd love to do something like this?
I think there were two. I mean, the main reason I enjoyed sports writing, like the idea, it was Wisden Cricket Monthly. I used to read that religiously. I just absolutely loved, I don't even know what actually, because I was so kind of ignorant of sports journalism then. I just knew that I liked it really. But there were two writers also who I thought were quite what we would now kind of perceive as modern writers who I really liked. One was Rob Smyth in WCM, who used to do the county roundup, but he'd always have like I was going to say pop music references, which makes me sound like I'm 85 years old, but it just things like that. He was always going about Steely Dan and things like that, and I just found it interesting. I didn't know who Steely Dan were, but it was just kind of an interesting and unusual way of writing. And there was also a football writer who he only did Manchester United stuff, a guy called Richard Kurtz, who was the same really. I bought a book of his in '95, which was all about, it was basically a breakdown of the previous season, match by match. Now that sounds incredibly dull, but actually it was anything but, because the language was so kind of vivid, his style was so entertaining, and it was all about the experience as much as the actual match. So those are probably the two who kind of made me realise that there might be kind of different ways to go about writing about sport, and that you could be quite kind of vivacious and vibrant, which I don't know whether I ever achieved that, but it's something that certainly was one of the reasons I wanted to get into sports journalism, I think.
Vivacious and vibrant sounds very much like you, Rob. So you can take that credit.
Well, yeah, you said about the history lesson, which just made me think about how bored I used to be throughout history at school. So I don't know whether that's a compliment or not, but anyway.
I think that happens to a lot of us. I think a lot of us who got bored with history in school try and write it in a more interesting way, and you definitely do that when you dredge up series from the past and you try and recreate it in your original style.
That's an interesting point. Maybe I owe my history teacher, Mr. Davis, a thank you for being quite so boring teaching us about the First World War. But anyway, and the other thing with WCM, as I said, I used to read that religiously. I absolutely loved it, but particularly after Tim Dillard took over as editor in, I think, '96, it just felt really kind of, I know I keep using the word modern, but it kind of did. And I looked back at, recently, funny enough, I bought a job lot of binders of WCM because I'd lost all mine. And it's really interesting looking back at some of the things they were doing that obviously are quite normal now. And in a way, it looks dated, but actually, compared to the time, it was just so kind of original and progressive. And also, just it was really accessible. That was the other thing that I learned, possibly without realising, but certainly from working with Tim later, was to try and make writing accessible. I remember one of the first things I ever wrote was full of kind of try-hard sentences and words, and he just, when I was doing work experience actually, and he just very kind of politely pointed out the flaw in that, and so that stayed with me as well.
Interesting. Given by the time frame that you're talking about, I'm assuming that you watched a lot of your early initiation into sports was in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, it was quite late. I'd like to know what I was doing with the first 10 years of my life, because I started watching football properly at the age of 11 and cricket properly at the age of 12. So I don't really know. Certainly those are my first memories of actually being a real kind of geek about it and following it religiously. So yeah, I'm not quite sure. But I do know my first 2 summers following cricket were England lost 4-0 to the West Indies and 4-0 to Australia. So and none of my friends liked cricket either, and no one in my family did. So I have no idea why I came back for more, but I'm glad I did.
Talking about black washes against the West Indies, one of my favorite pieces that you wrote was 2 years ago when you recreated the 1986 Jamaica Test, when Patrick Patterson basically turned English batsmen into jelly, so to speak, and he terrified everybody. And reading the piece, it's almost as if there was this little nuclear weapon going off in the middle, and everyone just was watching from the sidelines and absolutely nothing to do. Is there something that draws you to such games, especially because you mentioned there that this particular match wasn't televised? And was that something that made you want to look deeper into it?
Absolutely. The fact that I think it was the last England game that wasn't televised, there was a dispute. And so that gave it a kind of mythical air, especially the way people spoke about Patterson. Graham Gooch saying it was the one time he was scared for his safety. And I'd always had, again, I didn't follow cricket at the time, so it was more that as I became more interested, I went backwards and started to learn more. And I'd always been fascinated by that game and always kind of had in my mind I'd like to write about it. And then I just started researching it, and the more I looked into it, the kind of more interesting it became. And then I found out the kind of tragic story of Patterson essentially becoming a recluse, which I didn't know about either. And then there was a completely coincidentally, about 2 weeks before I was due to file the piece, there was a brilliant piece by a guy who tracked him down. So I mentioned that at the end of the lecture. But yeah, I'd always just been really interested in the idea, I suppose, particularly also fast bowling is such a kind of evocative and interesting thing. And although the last few years have been good, there was a long period where Dale Steyn was kind of the only great fast bowler. So I think that made it also more interesting to go back to that period. Yeah, and I think it was a huge thing, the fact there weren't any highlights. I really like that. I mean, there are a few highlights in the rest of the series, and there's a bit of Viv Richards 100 and so on. But it always interested me that it wasn't there. And often with these pieces, I find it is just, I'm really lucky to be in a position where if I kind of want to find out about them anyway, I think, well, I'll see if I can get someone to pay me to write about them. And then so I kind of have the pleasure both of discovering it and writing about it at the same time. I mean, there are other things that, more recent stuff that if I write about it, it will come from, a lot of it will come from kind of direct memory. But I probably prefer the pieces where I'm discovering it as I go along. And that was one of those.
I just have one line from the piece that I'd like to quote. Of course, I'll link it along with the podcast, but I'd like to quote it, where Rob says, I begin the quote, "It's the last England test match of which there is no footage. That's both a shame because we'll never see it, and a blessing because we'll never see it. It could never be as vivid or terrifying as it is in the imagination. The lack of footage makes it almost mythical nightmare." Close quotes. And I think that sort of sums up pretty much what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting because of that, and also just anything around fast bowling. I mean, like anyone, I guess. I just find it so interesting because it's such a kind of naturally exhilarating thing, and also Patterson, interestingly, kind of ties in with something you said about. I often quite like not lost talents, but people who shone only briefly. I'm always kind of drawn to those. So Patterson, Duncan Spencer, people like that. There are others in football as well. I know Patterson had a good career, but he never reached the heights of that tour when, by all accounts, he was just absolutely terrifying. And Jeff Dujon said that was 2 spells from him were the fastest he ever faced. That game, and I think it was Melbourne, 88-89, when I think Steve Waugh bounced him the night before, and then he went in dressing room, threatened to kill everyone. And then the next day he took a 5 for. And I think Dujon took just a routine delivery, and as he did so, it broke his finger. So yeah, I just sort of find that really interesting. The fact that Patterson, of all those astonishingly good and fast bowlers, he was by all accounts the quickest.
Yeah, I think I was in the Caribbean in 2006, and I asked around for Patterson, and everyone who I asked around said they had no idea where he was. And they said, that he wouldn't really want to see me, and that I would be totally disappointed if I see him. And there were rumors about the fact that he had, lost his way with alcohol and drugs and other things. But the piece that you're talking about from Bharat Sundaresan was published in the Indian Express, and I'll definitely link it along with this piece. And that was some great work from Bharat. I think he went to the Caribbean three or four times before. And each time he kept asking around, and then he finally tracked him down. That was the kind of story that you get like once in 20 years or something. So that was amazing.
Yeah, it really was.
Talking about these players, I've noticed a number of features from you on these forgotten talents. And you even wrote a column on the forgotten story in terms of football.
Yes.
How do you end up fixing on these, and what is it that draws you towards this particular genre?
That's really interesting. I've never thought about it. I'm kind of aware that it's something I like doing. I don't know. I think it's just that life is quite kind of nuanced and bittersweet, and I don't know. I just find people like that interesting. And also, I suppose a lot of them, it's people who I have a direct memory of. So, for example, there was a fast bowler at Kent called Duncan Spencer who was seriously quick, and I remember watching him a lot in the summer of '93, and then I almost forgot about him, as I kind of my life, went to university, became, I watched Kent, but you didn't focus on it as much, and then it just suddenly dawned on me one day to have a look what became of him, and then I don't know, really, it's quite interesting as to why. I'm sure there's some interesting psychological reason, possibly related to self-esteem issues, but I do find characters like that really interesting.
I think the other reason could be, and I can relate to this because I watched Indian cricket through the 90s when India was pretty bad, especially when traveling abroad, and there were a number of players tried, and as you mentioned in this piece, there were players like Greg Thomas, Richard Ellison, David Smith, who did well for brief periods, and then they were discarded, and then you don't know what became of them. And I think that the aspect of, I don't think what I'm trying to say is I don't think an Australian writer who grew up in the 90s or the 2000s would have such an inclination because they didn't really rotate that much. But in India and England, you went through so many players.
Yeah, you can take your pick of the most interesting characters.
Yeah, I recently wrote a piece where I began talking about this cricketer called Atul Bedade, who played just a handful of one-dayers for India. But in that brief time, there was a match where he hit a lot of sixes, and he was known as this guy who was this big hitter in the mid-90s who would come and hit sixes. And he left such a big mark on everyone. And everyone who read the piece remembered him and remembered that time and that sixes. And it's almost as if these players just come, leave a mark on you for 5 minutes, and then it stays with you all your life.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I suppose there is a certain romance to it as well. And I've always been fascinated by how much chance is involved in success in life, not just in sport, but I guess it's particularly acute in sport. So I guess every story is slightly different of people who, I mean, normally I would say people who don't make it, but you think, well, actually, by normal standards, they've still made it. They've still had some incredible moments and achieved far more than 99% of people. But I suppose, I don't know. I suppose there is something romantic about the idea of could have been a contender and all that. I don't know. It's an interesting, and yet partly, but you think, well, actually, they were someone. But you know what I mean. Like there's a guy who played a couple of tests for England called Mark Lathwell, and I'd love to do something with him. It would never happen because he threatened to sue me once, which I felt terrible about. But he's a really interesting story because he just not unlike Patterson, just didn't become a recluse. But I don't know what he's up to now. I had no interest in kind of talking about his career or anything. And he was seen as the next David Gower. That's how good he was in county cricket. I suppose you just think that there's always an interesting story behind it, and also a kind of I like stories that are fairly bittersweet, I guess.
Talking about Spencer and fast bowling and Greg Thomas and all these players, do you think that they also benefited in a way from the time in which they played in the era that was pre-helmetless for some, and also where the fully protection hadn't come in? Because today I feel that however fast a bowler is, and we've had some tremendous fast bowlers in Dale Steyn, Mitchell Johnson, and now we have Bumrah from India who's doing really well. But I think that the atmospheric aspect of Patterson being so terrifying, or of Dennis Lilly running in and the Australian crowds going kill, kill, kill. It just seems that we've gone past that stage, haven't we?
I think we have, although there is one huge exception, which is the 2013-14 Ashes, when England were so overwhelmed by Johnson. It's really interesting when you see the players talk about it. And I think there was genuine fear in that series. However, he was he was a kind of a once-in-a-generation bowler, as Lily said, at his absolute peak. So that's unusual. I do agree. And I think the other area they're probably benefiting from, people like Spencer, is that there were so few, and always still are really, so few fast bowlers in England. But particularly in the 80s and 90s, it felt like anytime I remember the excitement when you would see RF against someone's name rather than RFM, because it meant right fast, obviously. And it was so unusual that anyone over 90 miles an hour, we would get a bit giddy and excitable about. So I think there was that as well. And that would apply to Greg Thomas. Obviously, there weren't many others. Devon Malcolm was the main one. Not too many others. Darren Gough Gough was fast, but probably not blistering in the way Malcolm could be. And Thomas.
We in India remember Paul Jarvis.
He's an interesting one because he played. I think he played his last tests in India in '92. Oh, he may have played in Sri Lanka on that tour. But yeah, he's an interesting one because he actually bowled really well. That was that diabolical tour when England were a complete shambles, and he bowled quite well. But I'm pretty sure he never played again, certainly in Test cricket.
In fact, one of my early games was a one-dayer in Bangalore when Jarvis took 5 wickets. And he shared the Man of the Match award with Javagal Srinath. And even now, if people from Bangalore of a certain age will remember Paul Jarvis. And I remember that piece that you wrote about that tour as well. I'm going to link that. Another fine recreation of a shambolic, I think you called it the omnifiasco.
Yeah. So I think someone in the office might have, or Omni Shambles, but yeah, that was easily the most farcical. I mean, probably the most kind of devastating defeat I've seen England have was the 2013-14 Ashes. But I don't think this sounds strange, so I don't think they did a huge amount wrong then, whereas the India tour was just a shambles from start to finish, some of which was beyond their control. I mean, there were stories I think there was a pilot strike, stories of people genuinely saying their, goodbyes and stuff a couple of times. But also, so there were so many bad decisions and just so much naivety on that tour. It was a complete farce.
Yeah, there's some wonderful lines in that piece, including how Keith Fletcher, the England manager,
I know,
went to South Africa and saw Anil Kumble bowl and said that Kumble is not going to bother the English batsman. And you say in that piece that he not only didn't read Kumble's leg spinner, he also didn't read the straighter one. To that effect.
I feel a bit sorry for Fletcher because people say he was a genuinely nice guy, and he came at a bad time for English cricket. By all accounts, he was a brilliant coach with Essex, but there were some things when he was in charge of England that were just so messy. But yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe so much of the things that not just me, but a lot of English writers find interesting all stem from our adolescence as cricket fans.
Yeah, so there was one piece that you wrote for the Cricket Monthly in Cricinfo. It was on David Warner, which I was lucky enough to edit that piece. And you had one line in that piece that always intrigued me, and I don't think I spoke to you about it then, but you said, football seems to accentuate the bad in a person and cricket the good. Can you expand a bit on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this applies less now because I'm less interested in football. But I found certainly when I was younger, and I didn't realize at the time, but I watched the two sports in such different ways. You know, I was so kind of one-eyed when I watched football. I get angry really easily and almost became, well, not like David Warner, but there was a side of my personality that wouldn't come out in any other context, and not an entirely nice or likable one either. Whereas cricket,
so in a fever pitch kind of way, the Nick Hornby fever pitch kind of way.
yeah, exactly. But I found with cricket, I never really got angry at all. You know, and don't get me wrong, it's not that I'm desperately want England to win. But I don't know. I just feel like it must just be the culture and everything else. But it teaches you to see the game with two eyes. I mean, I know not everyone feels the same. You know, I remember getting really annoyed in 2009 when Ricky Ponting was being booed everywhere. But conversely, had it been the football equivalent, like if I was watching a Manchester United Arsenal game, for example, then I would have felt like the same kind of irrational aggression towards someone like Thierry Henry or Patrick Vieira. I just found that really interesting, and I think it clearly doesn't apply to everyone, but I do think, as a general rule, people who support cricket teams are more kind of considered and two-eyed than those who watch football. Not always, though. I mean, there are exceptions to everything, but yeah, in my experience, that's been the case anyway, and particularly from personal experience.
So in terms of minute by minute and over by over, I mean, as I mentioned earlier on, you've almost nailed the format. Nailed the format to the extent that you're not formulaic, but you're so inventive each time you do it. But talk to me a bit about the strain of the whole thing. Is it on autopilot now? Is it something that you've done so often that it just comes naturally? Or is it something that you still need to really put in a lot of thought into?
I think it partly depends on the game, how important it is, and also how dramatic it is. So it's such an obvious and slightly naff thing to say, but no two live blogs are the same not just because of what you're describing, but also the experience you have while doing it. So it's funny, I always remember Andy Bull, who I worked with at The Guardian, saying during, I think it was 2009 Ashes, we used to do the overovers together, and one of us who would be sat next to the other while they were doing it. And he said, you should see your face while you do it. Like, apparently I was grimacing all the time and making all these funny, because it's such a kind of deep state of concentration that you have to be in most of the time. And afterwards, it's probably harder than it looks in a way, but then also the more you do it, obviously the more comfortable you become, like with the format. And even when something crazy happens, I probably get slightly more frazzled now than I would 5 years ago, but I think that's more to do with being slightly older and kind of just my brain doesn't always work as quickly as it did before. So yeah, it's interesting how the experience has changed so much. Every now and then I look at an old one if I'm checking a fact or something, and it's like almost like reading a different person. It's really interesting how the style has evolved over time. With both of them, but probably more so with the cricket. I don't know. I think it's great fun. I would say it's probably the most fun I've had professionally. Certainly things like 2005, obviously. I keep thinking, I always come back to Peterson's innings because to over those was such an exhilarating experience. It really was. And I was quite lucky that I did most of his landmark innings. Certainly towards the end, I did the 100 in Colombo, the 100 against South Africa, and the 100 in, where was it? The 186 against India. I forget where it was.
In Mumbai.
In Mumbai, yes. And those experiences were just so good. And obviously there are other times when it's incredibly boring. I remember there have been times when I've had to kind of be biting my lip trying not to fall asleep. I remember one series, it was England were away to Bangladesh, and so I had to do it in the office at 4 a.m. and I was doing it on my own throughout the series. And there was a game when Jonathan Trott was fighting for his place, and I think he scored 68 in about 5 hours, and it was such a struggle because nobody was emailing. The lights in the office were off, and they were auto sensors, and they kept coming on occasionally. So it's such a kind of variety of experience. And it used to be, the one thing I do miss, because I don't do it in the office now, and Andy Bull doesn't do it anyway, but I do miss the shared experience of doing it with someone like him or Lawrence Booth earlier before he left the Guardian. That was always good fun as well. But it's great. I mean, I can't wait for the World Cup. I really am so excited about doing some England games and potentially doing a semi-final or a final. It's kind of, it feels that you get to a certain age, you almost feel like you've not done everything, but that there aren't so many new experiences in journalism. But this feels like it will be one or could be one anyway. So yeah.
So I sometimes when I read your over by over or minute by minute, I wish that there was some kind of a bot that picked up your best line and tweeted it out, because then all those tweets would just go viral in no time. I remember last year there was this England-Pakistan series, and I must quote this absolute peach of a line that I came across. I start quote, "Pakistan are in the mood just now. Nobody more than Hassan Ali. The first two letters of his first name and surname spell Hal, and he personifies the Hal of Pakistan cricket." Now, surely this is something that you thought about before, right?
Before I went, I do remember that, because I remember wondering if it was too cheesy and if it was too contrived. So that was, I think it was after lunch, and I think it just came often. I mean, it wasn't something I had written down. Use this one day. It was probably something I thought about while watching the morning session or whenever before I was due to come on to the over by over. I mean, sometimes, for example, I think the World Cup next week, I'll probably think about the introduction for that a bit more than the first game, more than I would normally. So it depends on it varies on the importance as well. It's quite nice. I quite like that period before, just before you're going on, when you kind of think about an introduction, particularly if something really exciting's happened. Like I remember doing the Champions Trophy semi-final when Pakistan beat England, and I did the second innings, so when Pakistan were chasing. And even though it was really disappointing as an England fan, it was also so exciting to see Pakistan bowl like that. It was one of the best bowling performances I've seen in years. And I remember like the last kind of 20 overs, I was torn between watching the game and wanting them to do well, but also trying to do a decent introduction to convey the sheer excitement of watching Pakistan.
So what does a minute by minute and over by over do to your memory? Because from personal, when I was working for Cricinfo and doing ball-by-ball commentary for matches, I found that I was really immersed in it during the game. And as you mentioned, I was just absolutely engrossed with what was happening. But the minute the game ended, everything would just be a blank. And if you ask me about any of those games now, I would not be able to tell you much. So, something like Patterson, you've done all these innings, you've covered it when it was happening, but how much of them do you remember now?
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder with Patterson, particularly because those are some of the few innings I've bothered to watch highlights of and repeatedly and have kind of saved on the planner. So I don't know how much of the memory is genuine and how much is kind of planted subsequently. There are certainly, I would say the bigger moments are still quite vivid, as much the actual experience as of blogging as actually as what I was watching. Like I remember Joe Peterson's 149 at Headingley in 2012 against South Africa, which was on Super Saturday of the Olympics. So basically, the cricket was an afterthought in The Guardian. Nobody cared. And I was looking around. I had my headphones on to the over, which we always did. And it was all about, I don't think I said anything, but I think I was always like, just looking, people always pleaded with someone to make eye contact so I could tell them to get the cricket on, and things like that. But there are, I would say the majority, 95% of games, I couldn't tell you a huge amount about. There are some I don't even remember doing. I was talking to a friend last year, a Man City fan. He said, "Oh, do you remember when you did that game? I think it was a game when they were knocked out of the Europa League." And I said, "No, that wasn't me." And he sent me a link, and it was. And I don't remember doing it at all. It's funny because I think part of that is just aging though, because I feel like you have a real fertile period that you recall in sport. And mine's probably from about the late 80s to sort of the mid to late 2000s. So I think it's a natural fade anyway. I remember being really snobbish when I was younger, when I would read autobiographies or whatever, and people would get dates wrong, and I'd think, or facts wrong, think, oh, you've got that wrong, and feel really superior. And of course, then you get to a certain age and you realise why people forget stuff. So if you ask me about, I don't know, for example, the 2013-14 Ashes, and I covered all of that on the over by over, or most of it. And obviously I remember Mitchell Johnson, and I remember a few deliveries, but I couldn't tell you much, particularly the last two tests. I could hardly tell you anything. Whereas I feel like 2000, even like the 94, 95 Ashes, which I watched as a fan or followed as a fan, I could give you a really detailed summary of every test. So I think part of it is just aging, or maybe that's my justification for it. I don't know.
I was reading the piece that you wrote about England's tour to India in 92-93, the tour that we spoke about just recently. And you said the England squad and the supporters remembered the 1990 series at home to India, which was when Graham Gooch made 333. And you said they averaged 72 runs per wicket, then a world record in a 3-match series. So how do you find such a thing in Stats? Can you actually find this on StatsGuru?
Yeah, Stats Guru is incredible. You can do it. You can find the highest average by a team per wicket per series. And another one I remember I always look up is highest run rate in a game by a team, because there was a game in '94 when England thrashed South Africa when Devon Malcolm took 9 for 57, but they also batted almost with demented abandon in that game, and I think they scored something like 4.5 and over, which would be quite fast now, but in '94 was almost unprecedented. And you can search things like that, and I think I found that in the 20th century there was only one faster scoring team in a match, something like that anyway. But yeah, so StatsGuru is so good. You can really specifically look for really kind of minute stats, which is, Travis Basavi was the guy who invented it. Just a genius. It's so good.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and I've used it a lot, but I think I still need to use it even more to understand the secrets that I can cover there. But back to Peterson. First of all, you wrote that Peterson. Reading that Peterson piece, there was so much of fondness that came through for Peterson. I remember you wrote a piece long back saying Graham Thorpe was your favorite cricketer, or one of your favorite cricketers. Did Peterson usurp Thorpe to the throne?
Probably I'd say he gave me the kind of the most memorable and euphoric moments watching cricket. Definitely, I still think I probably prefer people like Thorpe and Rob Smyth, just because they're from a different time. They were my kind of original heroes, and Peterson is such a kind of I don't know, divisive character. But I would say, funny enough, I was asked recently to do something on my favourite innings, and I just kept thinking it just kept coming back to Peterson, different innings, and I thought, I can't do this. I've written about him so many times, so I did something else, but I kind of qualified it by saying it was all Peterson, because it just, I feel like every thought, whether it's conscious or even unconscious, just comes back to the experience of watching him. But and even actually on TV, because I hardly ever saw him live, because most of the work I've done is office based. But by a distance, I would say, in terms of an individual, he was the most thrilling and kind of mind altering that I watched.
So you did make a comparison between Peterson and David Garr, in that piece, and you said how, I quote, to criticize him for a poor shot is like moaning about an ecstasy come down or a broken heart at the end of the best relationship of your life. Stop quote. And do you think that Peterson's genius wasn't recognized as much in England as it was outside? And do you think that the English approach, the traditional approach to, I don't know, Ian Bell maybe, or a boycott was something that held back the admiration for him?
Yeah, up to a point. It's quite a complicated subject, isn't it? Because it all ties in with his character as well. A lot of people didn't like him. Whether that's fair or not, I don't know. I do think he was vindicated on a lot of things. I mean, the IPL in particular, and the way England have now focused on one-day cricket and also recognised things like burnouts. I mean, he was pretty much the first to complain about that. But also this whole, and I know it was more in Test cricket, the whole "it's the way I play" thing, but that's been the culture of English cricket in all forms, really, certainly in one-day cricket for the last 4 years. And I do feel like he was slightly unfairly criticised for... now, it's difficult because the culture at the time was slightly different. I mean, I do think it was wrong. I think people didn't really understand him because he was so unusual for an English batsman, certainly at that time. There was no one else, really. Obviously, there'd been both of them in the past. Gower in a slightly different way. Then you have Morgan coming through in one-day cricket. But that was it, really. Butler a couple of years after. So, yeah, I do think he was unfairly criticised a lot of the time because, I mean, I have no idea what it's like to be a genius batsman, but I can imagine that the way all thoughts and instinct come together, like you simply cannot, the idea that he should play these unique, astonishing shots and never get out playing one of them, it's just ridiculous. And sometimes the burden on him was astonishing. I remember the 2007 World Cup when England were diabolical, and I think he came in at number 3, and of course England were always losing an early wicket, so he basically was asked to be the pinch hitter, the anchor, and the finisher. It was, the burden on him was extraordinary.
So he would have fit pretty well in this one-day side, wouldn't he?
Yeah, perfect. I mean, Morgan would captain him really well, I think. It's difficult to know. I don't get me wrong. I think Andrew Strauss is an incredibly impressive man. And it's so hard to know without knowing what goes on behind closed doors. But clearly, Flower and Peterson jarred increasingly over time. Strauss and Peterson, I know less about that really, but I do wonder if more attacking captains like Vaughan and Morgan, how he obviously played under Vaughan at the start of his career, but I mean, if he'd done so for the majority of his career, it'd be interesting to know. And I think he would certainly excel under Morgan, not just because of the way he would be man-managed, but also because obviously the freedom, there would be no consequences for a bad shot, really.
And in a way, it's the exact opposite these days for someone like Jos Buttler, isn't it? I mean, everyone has embraced his aggression and his innovativeness. And if he were to get out to a bad shot in the World Cup semi-final, I don't think people... I mean, I'm sure people will be disappointed, but I don't think people are going to vilify him the way they would have KP.
No, absolutely. I think part of that isn't just Peterson. It has changed. But even you go back to Mike Gatting's reverse sweep and how much he was criticised for that in the 87 final. But that's nothing to do with character, really. That was just kind of, again, the kind of English orthodoxy and kind of fear of the unknown and the unusual. But you're right, yeah, I don't think that would happen now at all. I think, obviously, there comes a point if someone keeps doing it, then it becomes an issue. But if it's occasional, and it was repeated, it's not like he was smacking it to long off every innings. And the same with these, some of these players now play some terrible shots, particularly in Test group, even the one-day team. But I just think it goes with the territory. You cannot have people, particularly like Butler, smashing sixes all over the place and not expected to get it wrong occasionally. I don't know how or why people would expect that to be possible.
How much of the fear of the unknown and the English orthodoxy has to do with the insularity of the way a lot of people in England watch the game? I mean, there was a period, not now, but there was a period, through for many decades where a lot of people in England, including English cricket journalists who mainly watched only England play. And if two other teams were playing in another part of the world, they were not necessarily clued in. So a lot of their benchmarks of a great innings or an innovative style was based on what they saw in England. And then suddenly in 1996, they come across Sana Jayasuriya and Faisalabad, and they're all like in shock. But the fact is that Jayasuriya was doing that for a few months before that. I mean, for a while before that. And there were other batsmen doing it too. So do you think the insularity held them back in a way?
Yeah, I think so. I think partly, I mean, that they were under Railingworth then, by then he was in his 60s, and I think he had a completely different idea of one-day cricket. But I do think you're right. I think it didn't help. I mean, England's such a strange country. It's beyond my intelligence to understand the kind of mixture of arrogance and insecurity. But I think there was an element of that, definitely. 96, they were caught so cold, which is weird because they actually, in 92, they played a pinch hitter of their own in both of them. And now, obviously, he wasn't a hurricane like Jayasuriya, but it was the same kind of principle. I think in 96, they were partly caught cold because they hadn't played one-day cricket, I don't think, in Asia since that India tour 3 years earlier. So they had almost no experience.
In fact, they had drawn that series in India 3 years earlier, the one-day series. So they were suddenly in between 92, 93 and 96, they just seem to have forgotten how to play the game.
Yeah, it's strange because the funny thing about English cricket in the 90s, one-day cricket, is the record at home was actually really good, except for when they hosted the World Cup and made fools of themselves. But they won. They beat Australia 3-0. I think they beat West Indies 3-0 in 91. They won most series, but away from home they weren't great. And particularly, they played such little cricket in Asia in the 90s. They didn't play a Test series, I think, from 93 to 2000. And it was just, I sort of have a bit of sympathy for them in that tournament because it was just so different to what they were used to. Even, at that time they were still playing 55 overs in a domestic competition, which is crazy. The regulations were different with regard to men outside the circle and so on. So that didn't help. But English cricket, particularly in one-day cricket, was very naive in the 90s. And it's taken them a long time to kind of, they lost so much ground that they never really recovered. They had good spells. Occasionally got to a Champions Trophy final in 2004, but it never felt like they were becoming a consistent, credible one-day team until Morgan and Bayliss and Farbrace after the last World Cup.
They were a very naive team in the 90s, except, and you, of course, being the specialist of forgotten stories, would remember
the Sharjah.
Adam Holyoke and his team in Sharjah.
Yeah, that's a strange one because obviously there are suspicions over at least one game, I think. But that was great fun because it was so unusual. It was a load of what were called bits and pieces cricketers like Dougie Brown, Holyoke, Mark Elam, Matthew Fleming, who I loved at Kent. I thought he should have played a lot more for England, actually. He got a really good one-day record. He didn't play about 10 games, but they binned him shortly before the World Cup. Yeah, but then they didn't kind of follow through with that. There was always that kind of, I don't know, sense of almost that by deviating that far from the Test team, they were somehow always being unfaithful to English cricket, And that they, as soon as they had a couple of bad results under Holyoke, they got rid of him as captain. And there was the Warwickshire team who won almost everything in '94 under Dermot Reeve, and now, a lot of them were kind of reasonably limited players, but they played such kind of modern one-day cricket, and yet hardly any of them played for England. Reeve should have been one-day captain for a long period, probably. It just felt like Test cricket was obviously always far more important, and England just didn't play enough one-day cricket. That was the other thing. Other teams for so long played and until quite recently, actually, played probably, 20 games more per year. Maybe not quite that many, but certainly I remember looking once between World Cups how many games had been played. England were miles behind.
We used to get quite a bit of coverage of English county cricket back in India, and we used to see some terrific players playing the one-day competition. There was this Ali Brown, who was so good, and he probably played in the Sharjah series as well. And he was so good, but he didn't seem to get much of a chance. And there were all these players who were scoring really quick compared to those in the English national team, but they were not getting picked into the side.
No, they would play a few games and they would be quietly binned the first opportunity. I mean, I don't know why, but I wonder if there was a kind of perception that one-day specialists at that stage were intrinsically inferior, because a lot of them were sloggers or whatever. And so they would have a look at them, but they would never quite be made to feel welcome. They wouldn't be given that many chances. Whereas obviously we've seen what's happened recently. In some ways, Jason Roy is a kind of, not in style, but in spirit, is the same kind of player as Ali Brown. Played for Surrey, an opener who just scores very, very quickly. Whereas Roy was given a lot of chances and started reasonably slowly. It was obviously he had something, but he started quite slowly. And had someone like Brown put the same scores, that got the same scores as Roy, he would have been dropped. So maybe it was that. Maybe they were never made to feel like they belong. It's one thing to say they looked out of their depth, but some very, very, very good players have looked out of their depth in their first few games at international cricket. You need time to adjust, and I don't think they ever got that, because there was always that snobbery in terms of Test cricket and one-day cricket. Brown scored 268, I think, in a one-day game in 2002. And I don't know. I'm sure there are definitely a lost generation of players who, given more time, would have done well at international level. Not all of them, obviously, because it doesn't work like that. But I'm sure there are at least 2 or 3 one-day specialists in the 90s who could and should have played, 100 ODIs, which was a lot for England in that time.
How much do you think the current England side and their attitude towards the one-day game, as well as their ability to pull off what they're doing, consistently chasing 300-plus totals and just going after it from ball one, how much of it has to do with T20? Because a lot of these players have been around T20 for a long time, and they play with a sense of fearlessness that hasn't been associated with English one-day cricket for ever.
Yeah, I agree. And that's the same makes this point, that they're the kind of first generation of players who grew up with T20. I always remember watching Australia in 2007, and I think it was 2007. It was one of the World Cups they won, and marvelling at how they'd basically done away with the anchor man. It must have been 2007 because Bevan wasn't there. And everyone was a punisher, basically, from 1 to 7. They were just all punishers. And I found that extraordinary. And of course, England in those days would have one at best in their team in Patterson. And now England are the same. Apart from Root, who still scores at a very, very good strike rate, they're all hitters, they're all punishers. And I'm sure it comes partly from that. Whereas in the past, anyone who played that way was a bit of an oddball or a bit unusual, like Patterson, then Morgan, and then slowly it just became. I think a lot of them were probably inspired by Patterson as well, but I think particularly just because they grew up in a culture where it was normal to do that. And so you're right. I think T20 has been a massive influence on how good England become at ODIs.
So how's the general mood like? I'm imagining it's a pole apart from 1999.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Yeah, I think there's a degree of suspicion just because kind of what's the catch, what's going on here. I can't help being pessimistic. I'm slightly worried that everyone assumes England have made the semi-finals. I think that's dangerous because a year ago I'd have said the same, but I just think there are now probably at least 5 teams and arguably 7 who you wouldn't be at all shocked if they made the semi-finals. The standard feels very high, so I'm slightly worried about that. What if they lose South Africa, which is entirely possible, and then the media get in a panic and everyone. Now, I would hope the team is strong enough, and particularly Morgan is strong enough, just to ignore all that. But I do worry slightly because I do think the competition is better than it was a year ago. Having said that, I think all things being equal, I'm sure they'll get to the semi-finals.
Well, I think until it's interesting how until 1992 they had a chance to win every competition, and then after that they've not had a chance to win any. So it's like the 2 phases of English cricket, from light to dark almost.
It's bizarre, isn't it?
It's crazy. And one of the things that I must talking about World Cup and one-day cricket, is a piece you wrote recently for the Cricket Monthly about the World Cup semi-final in '99. The unimprovable game, it was called, and many consider it the greatest one-day ever played. What were you doing that day? And what was...
This is terrible. I can't remember. I do know. I know I was working at the civil service, and I know we weren't allowed internet in the office. And I've got a really vivid memory. It's of the day after, of getting the paper on the way home and reading Michael Henderson's report, and just thinking it was the most brilliant report of the game. And it was that was also one of the reasons I wanted to become a sports writer, actually. I just remember thinking it was so good. But the actual game, I suspect I would have got home and found out on teletext, and then that's one thing I miss, actually. I miss finding a score, whether it's the end of the game or whatever, and then kind of going backwards and really quickly trying to gather information about how it got to this position. But I can't actually remember, which is really strange, because normally, I remember where I was for pretty much all the England games in that tournament. I remember where I was for the other Australia-South Africa game, a few days earlier in the Super Six. But yeah, I can't remember that, which is really weird.
Yeah, it's interesting how our memories are so selective, and sometimes the greatest events are just gone. They vanish. You don't know what you were doing then.
Yeah,
and I somehow relate to your point about going back and seeing the game in reverse almost. I mean, I used to often look at the fall of wickets in the scores.
Yes.
And then when I used to watch the highlights, I used to just say, oh, okay, so the wicket's going to fall maybe a few runs later. So, okay, I need to watch out, kind of thing. So that was interesting.
I also, one thing that was quite funny was when you would turn on the radio and you would, whether it was football or cricket, just try and gauge from the commentator's tone who was on top or what happened. And it's funny that I always vividly remember the night Ben Hollioake died. I got home, it was a Friday evening in English time, and I got home and turned the radio on, and you could tell instantly that something grave had happened. It was just different. The tone was just different. I think it was Jonathan Agnew commentating, and it was. I remember that really vividly. Just leaving it on, thinking, what's happened? Why is the tone quite like this? And then a few minutes later, found out.
All right. So yeah, I've pretty much covered everything, and this was great chatting, Rob. Thanks so much for joining.
I know it was great fun. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for joining us in this edition of the podcast. It was wonderful to hear from Rob Smyth on cricket writing, English cricket in the 90s, over by over, minute by minute. There was so much that we covered. And hopefully England go well in the World Cup and give Rob a chance to celebrate at the end of it all. You can follow us on iTunes and Spotify and wherever else you follow the podcast. You can go to 81allout.com. You can follow us on Twitter at 81allout. And we look forward to having you on more such shows. Thank you so much.
He'll come back for the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series. They're going to get back for two. India home. Lords goes wild.